Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don in the host chair today, flying solo, and we're going to take a fairly short trip back in time, just back to the beginning stages of World War II. So we're going back to 1939 today here on the show, and we're going to look at the historical what if of what would have happened if the Allies had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. Sort of a timely show in the sense that what has recently premiered on Apple Plus TV has been the streaming channel there has actually premiered a movie starring Tom Hanks called Greyhound. And Greyhound covers a fictional but based upon reality account of a U.S. naval commander leading a destroyer and group of escorts for convoy missions during the Battle of the Atlantic. And of course, the Battle of the Atlantic represents that conflict that actually was the longest battle or the longest conflict in World War II, ranging from September of 1939 all the way through the period of May of 1945, essentially from the beginning of the war in Europe all the way to the end of the war in Europe, and was represented by the efforts to supply and get troops, material, and other supplies from the United States and Canada and North America over to the British Isle. So actually, the Battle of the Atlantic represented the efforts to continue to keep Britain supplied, not only with war material, but the other necessities of maintaining her independence against German aggression, and also represented a very important element of the war, as we'll talk about here as we talk about the historical what did and the historical what if, in terms of how important getting those materials through was to not only the war effort but the survival of Great Britain standing independent, particularly during the early stages of the war. So as we head down that path today here on A Fork in Time, we'll begin as we normally do, talking a little bit about the historical what did, and then we'll shift over in the historical what if. But before we do that, we're going to take a little break here and let you hear a word from someone who helps make the show possible. We'll be right back.
Alexis and Dawn here, taking a little break from recording to tell you about one of our fantastic sponsors and something we actually both enjoy, Audible, which is a streaming service. It's one of our favorite ways to read a book because we're actually not reading it ourselves. We're having somebody else read to us. So we're able to multitask and listen to some fantastic narrators all in one. But Dad, what are some titles that you've been perusing lately from Audible's library?
Well, some of them are in Audible's library, and some of them are actually in my own personal library because I've been an Audible user since 2006. And so I was looking particularly at titles that might be of interest to the folks that we know listen to the podcast who are interested in alternate history. So I'm on my smart device, which is how I listen to it. I listen to my Audible on my smartphone, connected either to the car or on headphones. Would be Philip Dick's The Man in the High Castle, for example. That's why I first was exposed to that. Long before it was the Amazon miniseries, I listened to the novella. Would be a good way to describe what it is. One of the more popular alternate history books of all time, Kim Stanley Robinson's Years of Rice and Salt, for example, is something that I've listened to there on my Audible account. The novels of Harry Turtledove. I know a lot of our listeners particularly have enjoyed some of his alternate history novels, particularly around the Civil War. But it's not just limited to alternate history novels or alternate history writings, for example, on Audible. There's real history, so nonfiction. Somewhere in the neighborhood of about 100,000 audio titles that are available on Audible. So what is the deal for Fork in Time listeners?
So the deal for our listeners, if you go to audibletrial.com/aforkintime, you can actually sign up for a free 30-day trial of Audible in addition to a free audio download from Audible. So great way to kind of test the waters, see if it's something you're interested in. I think you'll be really excited with it. I'm, of course, an avid listener with Audible. But yeah, audibletrial.com/aforkintime. Sign up for that free 30-day trial and get your free audio download. Again, you can pick from hundreds of thousands of titles. So we've mentioned a few, but you can peruse their library, see if there's something else that floats your boat, and we hope you enjoy.
We hope you do. Thanks. Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don, your host here today. And again, the historical what if today is looking back on what would have been different if the Allies had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. And as we often do here on A Fork in Time, before we can really explore the historical what if, it's often necessary to understand and explore the historical what did. So the historical what did, as I mentioned in the opening, was the Battle of the Atlantic represented the efforts by the Allies to keep the sea lanes and supplies flowing across the Atlantic, not only during the early years of the war, but throughout the course of the war. And the time that we're going to focus on here, and where we're going to take the break historically, where the historical fork is going to be, is actually going to be in the period of time that's more towards the early part of the war. So if you remember the early parts of World War II, the conflict begins in Europe in 1939 with the German invasion of Poland and subsequent German military action sweeping across the continent, ultimately moving forward to the period in the middle of 1940, May in particular, where France falls. British troops are forced to evacuate off the continent proper, the events that happened there at Dunkirk. And so that by the middle of 1940, we find that the island of Great Britain stands alone on the western edge of Europe, standing against what is now a Nazi-occupied France and Nazi occupation of most of the rest of Europe. And so during this particular critical period of time, there are two major things that are going on militarily that are having an impact on Great Britain's effort to participate in the war. One of those is the Battle of Britain. This is the effort by German forces using bombers, later using V-2 rockets, to try to subjugate Britain and to cause them either to accept either a surrender or some form of accommodation as a result of the attacks that would come from the air, the famed Battle of Britain. Prime Minister Winston Churchill dubbed the other effort that we're going to talk about today sort of the parallel to the Battle of Britain as the Battle of the Atlantic. And so what we have there is we have merchant vessels that are crossing from the United States and Canada, which is part of the Commonwealth, bringing materials and supplies over to Great Britain now as she is standing alone, again, after the Nazi occupation of France and the creation of what is sometimes referred to as Fortress Europe. Other thing important to remember during this period of time, 1939, 1940, in fact, the bulk of 1941, it's not until the very end of 1941, the United States is not an active participant in the war in Europe in terms of having declared war, sending troops, or actually providing direct military assistance. While they're closely allied with the British, during this period of time, Britain is standing basically alone in terms of what would eventually become the Allies. Obviously, the Soviet Union would become also part of the alliance as well, but is standing alone against German aggression. And so once they're forced to evacuate the continent proper, they are now defending the British Isle. And at that time, beginning in 1939, almost from the very outset of the war, there began to be an issue with German surface vessels and then later German U-boats, German submarines, that were attacking the merchant shipping that was crossing the Atlantic. And while ships from the United States were generally not harassed, if those ships were on their way or headed towards, certainly U.S. flagged vessels were not, if those ships were headed towards providing supplies to Great Britain, then they were subject to surface attacks. What eventually evolved there, moving away from the surface elements, as eventually the British Navy was able to eliminate most of the risk from German surface vessels, including their large battleships and other large cruisers, was the Germans began to have a tremendous amount of success sinking shipping cargo, merchant vessels, using U-boats, using underwater capable craft, in this case submarines. And in fact, in June of 1940, as this sort of reaches its peak after the fall of France, we begin what's often referred to as the happy time by the German Navy. This is from June of 1940 to February of 1941, when the U-boats became very successful at preying upon the shipping that was crossing and that were trying to make and bring supplies across to what was now an isolated Great Britain because of the occupation of France. Of course, Great Britain had imposed a blockade upon Germany and the continent, so this was a counter blockade that essentially Germany was trying to execute here. And during that period of time, beginning in June of 1940, again for about a 6 to 8 month period of time there, they were incredibly successful in terms of their impact on shipping. Somewhere on the order of 275 vessels were sunk during that period of time. If you actually look at the total number of casualties over the entire span from 1939 to 1945, the numbers are sort of astonishing. Over 3,500 merchant vessels, 175 warships. These are just Allied warships. There were over 36,000 sailors who lost their lives, over 36,000 merchant seamen, and that's not even counting the number of aircraft that were lost, somewhere above 700 aircraft from the Royal Air Force alone that were lost in the process of trying to escort and deliver supplies across the Atlantic. So during this critical time that we're going to focus on here, where we're going to take the fork, the pivot in time, is actually assuming in that period between June of 1940, when the Germans began to enjoy their greatest success using their U-boats, which began to hunt in packs, the so-called wolf packs, up through the early part of 1941, we're going to assume that they continue to have that success and that some of the changes in tactics and some of the other changes in strategy, which brought some support and some relief actually to the efforts that were going on here, actually did not come into play. And so under that scenario, what we're going to find is that this counter blockade that's brought into effect by Germany and their naval forces, combined with some assistance from their Italian allies, is very successful in terms of bringing the amount of materials that are able to transit across the Atlantic to a virtual standstill. It's interesting to note that during this period of time, the other impact that's on shipping is actually from the Battle of Britain. It's from the airplanes that were delivering bombs and that were doing other things to the British Islands, in the sense that they were bombing the largest ports, which in Britain happened to be on the southeast and southern coasts of the island and were well within range of the aircraft. And so the ability to move materiel by sea impacted both by the bombing actions that were taking place on the ports and the need to relocate ports to the western side of the British Isles to give them some security from the German air attacks, but also by the loss of vessels at sea, both to German surface vessels as well as to German U-boats. And so there comes a critical time here again in the latter part of 1940 and into 1941 where things are very much up in the air. In fact, it's not until March of 1941 that the tactic begins to be used where they begin to use escorts and other types of different ways of trying to counter the German U-boat threat. Now, eventually what happens in the real timeline is the United States enters into an agreement with Britain prior to entering the war, very much part of the Lend-Lease arrangements or things like that, where American war material, in this case it were 50 destroyers, that were actually loaned to or sold or exchanged to the British government in exchange for long-term rights to use British bases. And so the British Navy is bolstered with the arrival of 50 new warships from America, even though America is not formally an ally yet in the war. That allows them to reposition other resources, and eventually they're able to turn the tide at sea. But under our fork in time, we're going to assume that one of the possible scenarios actually did take place, which is with the German success of U-boat attacks, they ramped up successfully the production of German U-boats. You will see a lot of military historians that will tell you if the Germans had managed to accumulate 250 or 300 U-boats, if they had had that large of a force, it probably would have changed the outcome in terms of their ability to actually control the seas. And if they controlled the seas effectively, either blocking or sinking merchant vessels, they would have reached a point where they potentially would have been able to bring the island of Great Britain to its knees. And so under our fork in time, what we're going to assume here is that they were successful in continuing their success from the middle of 1940 on into 1941, and that by the time the United States or other powers might have come to their aid, it was too late to actually avoid the impact of losing the Battle of the Atlantic. And losing the Battle of the Atlantic, again, meant losing the ability to get materials and supplies across to the island, which was now essentially under blockade by German forces. So that's what's going to be our fork today. That's where we're going to depart from the timeline of history, is assuming that a critical mass was reached in the Battle of the Atlantic, and I'm going to assume here, let's say in early 1941 to the middle of 1941, where Britain would have been placed in a unique situation where it had to make a choice. And that choice would be whether it would continue to fight on and suffer the consequences of an effective naval blockade as well as the continuing efforts of bombardment from German forces, or they would have made the decision to come to some type of accommodation with the government of Germany. So I'm going to look at two possible scenarios here that will lead us down a couple of different additional paths, but the first of those is the assumption that Britain would not capitulate, so that they would continue to fight on. In doing so, they would have had the risk of starvation for much of their populace, just the very necessities of life, the things that needed to be imported and could not make it there as a result of import, would have made life very difficult and unbearable inside of Britain on the island itself. And so one of the possibilities is, well, if they continued to fight on, they would have eventually been weakened and would have eventually maybe been in a position where the Germans could have been successful in launching a cross-channel invasion and actually taking and seizing Great Britain, the Isles, the British Isles, by force. So the first one is the German invasion option. The German invasion option would have been a costly affair, both for Britain and for Germany. But certainly if it had reached the point where Britain's ability to resupply itself, if much of its population were starving, undergoing the other types of hardships that would have come as a result of the successful blockade, it's easy to imagine that an isolated Britain could have fallen to German forces, not just by the bombing campaign, but actually eventually a German naval amphibious invasion across the Channel. It's Normandy in reverse, if you will, where German forces actually come across and land on the British Isles. Under that scenario, there is no doubt that the fighting would have been intense. The fighting would have been prolonged. It would not have been an easy task for German forces to actually conquer British forces on the island, but I think that it would have been entirely possible after a long, protracted, probably not even just measured in months, maybe as long as a year or more. Ultimately, Germany, if you have an isolated Great Britain, might have been able to hold out for that long, but most likely would have fell to Germany. Under that scenario, if there actually is a German invasion, one of the possible responses, of course, is the United States, who had tried to guide itself and continued down a path of neutrality, may have chosen then to intervene in the war and then tried to raise an expeditionary force to come to the aid of Britain. But understand why they would now be in this situation. Germany would have had such a successful toehold in the North Atlantic and the ability to restrict trade that now the possibility of U.S. military forces either coming to the aid or rescue or humanitarian efforts in the form of food and other supplies crossing the Channel, not the Channel, but the Atlantic, would have had to face the consequences of a large German U-boat force, expanded German surface forces. The types of things that had made the blockade a success would also make it very difficult for American forces to come to the aid of British forces. So even in the scenario where with a German invasion, the United States would have chosen to respond militarily, it's not an absolute clear-cut outcome, at least in the short term, that the United States would have been able to successfully come to the defense and then help Britain repel the German invaders. While certainly possible, it's tough to know exactly how that would have played out. It's not an absolute certainty that that would have happened. Of course, the other scenario would be, given the challenges and the difficulties that we just looked at there, that we just reviewed, is that the United States would choose not to come to the aid of Britain or feel that it was impossible to come to their aid. And so Britain then would have fallen under a military occupation by Germany. Under that scenario, again, there very likely would have been, just as there was in France, there would have been a resistance. There would have been continued efforts to fight back after having been subdued. But ultimately, at least for a period of time, Germany would have been successful in taking control of Britain. And under that scenario, under the military invasion scenario, the military occupation scenario, Britain falls. The government is then forced to either flee to become a government in exile, probably fleeing to Canada, perhaps to another British possession around the world. And the remainder of British troops that were not under German control would have been the troops that remained that were present in North Africa, that would be continuing to fight there. Only now they would be standing alone without the aid of the United States, as they subsequently would have under this scenario with Britain having fallen. So the occupation scenario, while it's easy to see that after a period of time, Britain may have been able to resist, to throw off, or that other nations would have come to their aid and eventually have liberated them. That would not be an instantaneous thing, or even if it did happen where the United States attempted to provide liberation immediately, it would have been very challenging to mount that exercise from across the Atlantic, particularly when Germany would have been able to exercise with the U-boats and the other craft, making that a very difficult proposition crossing across the North Atlantic. I actually think the more logical scenario, though, is an alternative scenario, and that's the scenario where there's a capitulation by Great Britain in the form of some form of accommodation or surrender. So in that case, Great Britain may have surrendered to avoid the potential atrocities against her people, to avoid additional loss of life, and to realize that it was inevitable that they would likely fall under military occupation. So under that scenario, again, you may have two flavors of that. One where there is a government that flees, and so you have a government in exile that then leaves the surrendered territory to the Germans to come and occupy again, now not with a military invasion, but with a more peaceful occupation where German forces come over and take control of Great Britain. Under that scenario, with a government in exile, again, it may go to Canada, as I mentioned, or some other place, but you would still have a separate British government. The other possibility would be actually that there would not be a government in exile, that they actually would surrender and allow themselves to come under the subjugation and control of Germany. So under that scenario, where there's no government that's created in exile, then you have the situation where the present king, George, would have surrendered to German forces. And it's very likely under either scenario, the conquering scenario, the first one I outlined, or the second scenario where there's a British surrender, that there may have been a forced abdication of George VI from the throne, and maybe the restoration, as many historians have suggested. Perhaps there's some evidence in the form of letters and other types of things which suggest this could have happened, that Edward VIII, who had abdicated the throne in 1936 to Mary Wallace Simpson, that he may have been restored to the British throne as the restored monarch, essentially under German control and at the hands of the German government. And so either you have the scenario where Britain has been conquered and there's a government in exile in, let's say, Canada. We'll use that as our common scenario. That is, perhaps that's where the previous monarch, where George goes, and where the remainder of the parliament and other government and other forces, those who can flee, actually make it to there, and there's a government in exile in Canada, with Edward having reassumed the throne as a result of a German conquest of England, or in the case of a German surrender, again, if there happens to be a government in exile, you have Edward, who's been restored to the throne now as a result of the subjugation, and as a result of perhaps a condition of the surrender is that King George would surrender the throne in favor of his brother Edward. In either scenario, you end up with a very different scenario than we're familiar with in the first part of the war. Again, remembering in both of these scenarios, the United States has not yet entered the war. So their choice to enter the war would be more likely favored under the scenario where there was an actual attack or an invasion of the British Isles. I think that's the type of thing that's much more likely to have responded with the United States declaring war back on Germany and beginning to mobilize. But under the scenario where there is a surrender of the British Isles, it's quite possible that the United States, who very much wanted to remain in isolation, may have chosen to accept that surrender and may have chosen, at least not immediately, to try to take action back against Germany. And so in that scenario, you have the United States never entering, at least at that phase or at that time, the war in Europe. How long the situation would have existed with a subjugated Great Britain? Could that have been a matter of months, a matter of years? Could that have continued down to the present day? I think that's an interesting thing to sort of the conjecture there. And for me, the actual how long that lasts is probably not so much what happens on what would be the German Western Front, what had happened with the conquering of Great Britain and the British Isle, but actually what happens with the war, with Britain now neutralized in the war between Germany and the Soviet Union. Remember that Germany had launched now the offensive on two fronts, having launched Operation Barbarossa, and was fighting against the Soviets. For an interesting background and some historical what-ifs on that, I would point you to one of our previous episodes where we talk about a different outcome, where either Germany had not launched Barbarossa or where they had a different success with Barbarossa. But if the Germans are able to come either to an accommodation with the Soviets after a period of time because of the fighting and the loss of life, or if Germany, because it could focus now its resources on the Eastern Front and have more success against the Soviets, they almost defeated them anyway, at least up until a point. Under that scenario, you may suddenly find an expanded, now continental-wide Germany that controls territory deep into the Soviet Union and the areas that we now think of later as sort of as the satellite and buffer states that existed during the Cold War. And you have a Germany that controls Europe up through the British Isles. So they have a secure west and a secure east. Under those scenarios, you could easily imagine a scenario where as we achieve a stalemate position, the war settles for a period of time, and either again for a period of years, a decade, or perhaps generations, a redrawn map of the world with Germany being the dominant force in Europe would exist. And under that scenario, it's easy to imagine, at least for me, that the United States would never choose to be involved and would never cross over and get involved in any type of action in Europe proper. If the hostilities came to a cease, there was no direct threat at that time to American interests. It's easy to imagine that America, still wanting to remain in its isolation position, would have stayed isolated. Of course, what changed in the real course of history is in late 1941, where the United States is attacked by Germany's ally, in this case, the other Axis power, Japan, with the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's actually not until after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the United States declaring war on Japan as a result of that attack that Germany declares war on the United States, and then and only then does the United States declare war on Germany. We actually talked about this also in a previous episode about a scenario where the start of World War II would not have been, for the American interest in World War II, would not have been an attack on Pearl Harbor, but a scenario that might have been an attack by German forces, which almost happened on Hoover Dam. I would point you back to that episode as being possibly what would be part of this what if as well. But under the scenario where the United States does not get involved in the war in Europe, Germany now controls Europe either by occupation or by occupation that has led to a settlement that ends the war with Great Britain now being a subject nation to Germany, maybe independent, but subject to German control and only exercising its independence within certain boundaries that have been established by Nazi Germany. Then the question remains, will the United States get into a war with Japan? Most likely, I think the scenario is there ultimately would have been a conflict between Japan and the United States simply because of the competing interests and the goals of the Japanese government, which led them up to the attacks at Pearl Harbor. That would not have changed regardless of what had happened necessarily with Germany. However, it's important to understand that Japan was fighting against the British forces, that were over in Asia. And that was an important part of the war leading up to the events of Pearl Harbor in late 1941, and then, of course, after that. So we also have the impact of Great Britain being neutralized, not only the impact that it would have in Europe, but the impact that a neutralized Great Britain would have in terms of Japanese expansion. So questions like what would happen in Hong Kong, what would be happening in Australia, what is the situation with Australia if there's no longer a Great Britain as part of the Commonwealth to come to their aid or their defense. The possibility exists the United States may then have felt more compelled with the absence of Great Britain to come to the aid of Australia as a democratic nation. But again, it can also change the calculus and what would happen for the war in the Pacific. And so I can easily imagine a scenario down this alternate timeline where the Allies lose the Battle of the Atlantic, where you have a fully occupied Europe under Germany with various states of occupation and various states of control, either the direct control of Great Britain or the essential control of Great Britain by neutralizing it and placing someone on the throne and into the government there that would be favorable to them, and how that could then ripple across for the balance of what we know from the real timeline being the rest of World War II, where a different outcome would have happened between the United States and Japan. So under that scenario where Japan is more successful in its expansion efforts throughout the rest of Asia, they may have chosen not to be as aggressive or expansionistic towards the United States, realizing that in the real timeline by 1941, because of the way things were heading, that they needed to try to neutralize the United States through a surprise attack, the Pearl Harbor attack, hoping to neutralize, catch them off guard, and be able to either buy time to take care of what they wanted to do with their expansion plans in Asia, or to have a weakened United States who really wasn't in a position to defend itself or fight back, come to an agreement with them that would avoid the hostility whatsoever. So if you think back to how this particular what if can play out, it's not just a European what if. If you remove the influence of Great Britain remaining independent during World War II, then becoming the staging area for once the United States became involved, where the efforts to retake, reclaim, and liberate Europe would be launched from. If you've lost that forward base that's represented by Great Britain, that greatly changes the timing and the potential outcome of the conflict in Europe, and ultimately the conflict in North Africa and other theaters as well, perhaps even over into the conflict between Germany and the Soviet Union. But it also has the potential, I think, in a substantial way to ripple across to what happens in the Pacific theater of the war. So we could have had World War II be a much shorter-lived event that would have led to a much more divided world. Now, if you will, there's the German-Japan alliance world that is pitted against what is left, which is the United States and some other democracies around the world, with perhaps the United States actually now taking more of an interest in what's going on in North and South America to sort of create a continent that stands united against Germany from Europe and Japan from Asia. And so you might have a situation there where the world may have become much more, think of a Cold War type scenario like we ultimately had between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's just now that the Cold War that would have existed would have been between the forces of the German occupation and the German Reich, as it would have carried down, having been successful during World War II to some degree, and its relationship with the Empire of Japan, who also might have had a different level of success because of what happened with the war in Europe. So when you're thinking down this particular what if, the Battle of the Atlantic has tremendous impact on the outcome in the Pacific. And when you look at both the Atlantic and the Pacific, now you're talking literally about the outcome on the whole world. So it might be argued that what happened, particularly between the middle of 1940, as Germany was having success in the Battle of the Atlantic, which eventually Britain was able to turn the tide, some of that with the assistance that was provided indirectly by the United States through the agreement that was reached there to lend some of the destroyers over, but just by the fact that Germany didn't have the resources and or the will to ramp up her U-boat production to reach the level that she was able to achieve a critical mass for success. That window of time, if you will, from the happy time as it's described by the German Navy, June 1940 through February of 41, and then slightly after that, particularly in March of 41 as the escort process begins to take place. If that critical moment in time doesn't happen, it's easy to see how the entire course of World War II would obviously have been changed. But when you go beyond that, realizing that World War II was the defining conflict of the 20th century in terms of how it set up politics, diplomacy, and world positions for the balance of the 20th century and down to where we are in the 21st century, it changes a lot. So that small deviation, that little bitty fork in the road with the Battle of the Atlantic back in 1940 and 1941 could have had a tremendous difference on where we are today. So we appreciate you joining us here today on A Fork in Time. I hope you've enjoyed a little exercise today. By the way, I do recommend the Apple movie Greyhound. What struck me there, particularly because Tom Hanks is in both, if you realize the realism and the way that Saving Private Ryan, particularly the opening sequences of Saving Private Ryan, give a good sense for what it was like on June 6th of 1944 at the invasion there at Normandy, and bringing unfortunately the horrors of war to life in a way that someone could understand what that meant to be there that day. I think very much the movie Greyhound does that for those who bravely exposed themselves and fought in a very different way during the Battle of the Atlantic and at sea during World War II. I think you'll be impressed by the intensity of the action. Everything that I've read, from what I know and understand, I think they go to great lengths to try to be realistic. Even though it is a fictional telling based upon a book, it's the type of thing that is very accurate in its fictional portrayal. and you really get a sense for the bravery that was involved, the desperation that was sometimes involved, and you certainly understand when you see the capabilities there of the German U-boats, how if there had been enough of them, with enough resolve, and the timing would have been such that the outcome of the war could have been changed. And so I would recommend Greyhound if it's something that you're interested in. I think it'll provide a good background and setting for the discussion that we've had here. So I would encourage you to do that. As we close out here, once again, we appreciate you giving us the greatest gift you can give us, which is your time. And we appreciate that. Certainly would invite you to visit us on our website. That's at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. There, as we talk about so often every week, the opportunity to provide feedback for us, to learn more a little bit about the podcast, to go back and listen to our back catalog. Also, if you'd like to support the podcast in various ways, there's links to our social media there. And certainly there's a link to our Patreon page there if you'd like to and can and are willing to support the podcast financially. We would certainly appreciate that as well. But regardless of how you choose to support us, you've given us the best support today that you can, which is you've given us the gift of your time and attention, and we appreciate that. So as we sign off here for another episode of A Fork in Time, we'll sign off the way we traditionally do, which is reminding you, if you happen upon a fork in history, a fork in time, our suggestion is take it. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkandtimepodcast.com. Join us next time.